So really what I was going to do was bring people up to speed in terms of what has been done in UK Biobank and how much of it came about, what was the rationale. And then there will be more detailed presentations, including the results from the UK Believe genotyping study that John referred to. And I would like to reiterate the comment he made, which was that proposals from researchers from around the UK for things that could be done to enhance the resource have leveraged additional funding that have resulted in the genotyping in that study, but also biomarker assays, accelerometry, and I'll talk about that as I go through. So what is UK Biobank? So when people were recruited between 2006 and 2010, they were aged 40 to 69, 500,000 men and women. Really quite detailed questions and measurements and stored biological samples, and we'll be going into detail as to what we have got. And then there were opportunities to add enhanced assessments in large subsets, which we have taken, but which there are certainly opportunities to take more. Every few years, we're doing repeat assessments in substantial subsets of the order of 20 to 25,000 participants in order that changes in baseline characteristics and other sources of variation can be taken into account in looking at the associations of risk factors with disease. Importantly, we have general consent for any kind of health-related research, both by academic and commercial researchers, and we have consent for follow-up through all type of medical and other health-related records, by which we gave examples of things like employment, education, and things like that. And the intent with the 500,000 people was to have sufficiently large numbers of people that during follow-up would develop some particular disease, because it's not really the 500,000 people which is the unit of assessment. It's the number of people who develop the disease that is of interest. And of course, that's going to be a small subset, or a relatively small subset of the total number. So that's why we need 500,000 at the beginning, because there might be 5,000 of this, 10,000 of that over the next 5, 10, 15, 20 years. And I wanted to illustrate, because I know a lot of people here are not epidemiologists, but why it is that one needs to have such a big number. So these are real data. We have 1 million people in 60 prospective studies with about 12 years of follow-up. So just to give a kind of context of what one might do in UK Biobank, if we had a different size study. So if we took 5,000 of those people and looked at the association, in this case, between blood pressure and the risk of coronary heart disease mortality at different ages. So in a way, we're looking at interactions, in this case, between age, blood pressure, and risk of a pretty common disease. It's very difficult to see what the pattern is. It's perhaps a general trend upwards, but you can't really determine the shape of that association. You can't look separately at the shape at different ages. And that's for an important, strongly associated risk factor. If we go from 5,000 people, so the kind of size of Framingham, up to 50,000 people, then the patterns become a little bit more clear. The confidence intervals around the point estimates become narrower. But if we look at the association of blood pressure with risk, is there a J-shaped curve at younger ages? Is it flat at older ages? Or is this just the play of chance? And when we go up to the size of UK Biobank, we get this nice focus. It's a bit like microscope or telescope. Everything comes into focus. And we see these beautiful log linear associations between blood pressure and the risk at different ages. And we can see that the relative risk is weaker, so the slope is flatter at older age on this doubling scale than at younger age, but the absolute differences are more extreme at older age because the absolute risks are bigger. So if we want to look at interactions, we need to be thinking at least in terms of units of UK Biobank, or the 1.3 million women in the Million Women study. In terms of recruitment, what we did was we worked with the National Health Service, and we were provided with the names and addresses of everybody that lived within about a 50-kilometer radius of the places where we wanted to put assessment centers. And this shows the distribution of those assessment centers. And we had about 6 of them running at any one time for about 6 months. They were chosen to enhance the heterogeneity of the population studied, so to get a good urban and rural mix by recruiting out from the center of towns and cities, a good socioeconomic mix, and ethnic diversity. So when we recruited in Scotland, we got few ethnic minority participants. When we recruited in Hounslow, Croydon, central London, we got large numbers. And in the end, we got about the same ethnic mix as the population as a whole. We also wanted to cluster these in case we wanted to recruit, to bring back participants to do enhanced assessments, such as the imaging assessment that you'll hear about. And this circle is showing the kind of area that we will be inviting people to the imaging center in Manchester that Paul Matthews will talk about later in the day. So people are being invited who participated here to come back now for imaging. So here's a typical approach. We set up a coordinating, an assessment center in a shopping center in Oxford, and then sent out invitations to people in both the urban area and the rural area around here. And overall, we got just under about 10% of people who were invited attended the assessment center. The people who were most difficult to recruit were younger individuals, males a bit less than females, more deprived rather than less deprived. So we probably are underrepresented, or we certainly are underrepresented with young males who are more deprived. But the important thing is that we're not trying to do a poll. We're not trying to be representative of the UK population. What we're interested in is having large enough numbers of individuals in different types of groups. We need heterogeneity, not representativeness, in order that there are enough individuals at various extremes in order to look at the association of particular risk factors with disease in the long term. So the study is not particularly good at saying what proportion of the UK population has this or that condition, but that doesn't cause problems when you want to look at what is the association with factors at baseline with disease in the long term. In terms of the baseline assessment and at the tea breaks and the lunch interval, you can go and look at this online up in the refreshment area as to what kind of data we have. Or you can, when you go back, you can look on the website and see all of the data that are in the database in terms of distributions of all the different variables. People spent on average about 50 minutes completing on a touch screen a whole series of questions about sociodemographics, ethnicity, work, employment, physical activity, smoking, etc., down to doing various tests of cognitive function and a hearing test, all of this done directly into a touchscreen computer. And then based on some of the questions here, they had a brief interview where coded information was obtained about their medical history and medication and their most recent occupation. This, of course, will be enhanced, the medical history will be enhanced by our ability to link to health records that Kathy Sudlow will talk about, not only going forward in time, but we're able to link into the past medical records of participants to enhance the information about their previous medical history. We've also looked at ways of enhancing information that's obtained from things like diet, from food frequency, which is notoriously poor at assessing people's diet. And the Cancer Epidemiology Unit, run by Valerie Burrell, who set up the Million Women Study, developed a web-based questionnaire for doing a diet diary, and you'll hear more about that. And John Gallagher in Cardiff has developed a questionnaire for doing more detailed assessment of cognition, which you'll hear about. A number of standard measures were done on all 500,000 people, shown here, kind of obvious things: blood pressure, height, waist hip circumference, body impedance as a supplement to body mass index, spirometry, and then heel ultrasound as a crude measure of bone density, which will be enhanced by the more detailed imaging. That was done on all 500,000 people, but once the study recruitment was going well, we got additional funding to do some more enhanced assessments in substantial subsets of the participants during the latter phases of recruitment. And in particular, the hearing test that was developed by the MRC hearing unit in Nottingham was done in 175,000 people, and a simple measure of vascular reactivity. Moorfields developed a very beautiful module on eye. So in 120,000 people, visual acuity, refractive index, and intraocular pressure were obtained. And then in the last 85,000 recruited, retinal images, standard photography, plus optical coherence tomography. And with the Cambridge MRC unit, there was developed an ergometry fitness test with ECG limb leads. So we've got these substantial enhancements. And the way it was done was people came in, they were introduced to the touchscreen system where they did their consent and signed their consent onto the computer, and then answered all those questions and did little quizzes about cognition and did hearing tests. Then they had the interview and blood pressure with a nurse, then the eye measurements, then the physical measurements, then the fitness assessment, and then they had various samples collected of blood, urine, and saliva that Tim Peakman, who coordinates the coordinating center and is the deputy chief executive, will talk about later. We're doing repeat assessments, as I mentioned, in order to be able to take account of the underestimation that one will get due to random error in baseline measures or other sources of variation in baseline measures, so that the associations can be adjusted for such variation. And this kind of variation may be caused by people making changes or by random fluctuations or long-term, that are either long-term or shorter term, and they could be due to all sorts of different factors. But if you have these periodic reassessments, then you can, in doing your analyses of the associations, make corrections for that. And we've completed the first cycle of reassessment visits in 20,000 of the participants between mid-2012 and mid-2013. And this just shows what the value is of doing that. Here is the association of coronary artery disease mortality with systolic blood pressure. If one just takes the baseline measure and one sees flattening at the end, and the question is whether that's biologically true or is it a statistical artifact, and the answer is it is an artifact. So if you take individuals in these different groups and do a remeasurement in a sample, as we're able to do with the repeat assessment, then you can work out where their true average is, and you get a much steeper association, so you're able to demonstrate that the risk factor is more strongly associated with disease. But also, it's clear that one is really studying a narrower range of the risk factor, and that there is no evidence of flattening at the extremes that have been studied. So it's very important in doing the analyses that one takes account of that. I've talked about some of the web-based assessments that have been done on diet and planned on cognition and then on mental health. Tim Peakman will talk about the wrist-worn accelerometry that's going on that has been developed by Nick Wareham, Soren Bragg, and others. You'll hear about the BioManky Chip, where we hope to have data released on the first 150,000 people by the end of this year. A standard panel of biomarkers, about 35 different biomarkers that will start to get released during next year, and the imaging that is also being piloted at the moment. But these enhancements came about because of researchers from around the UK having ideas about things that would enhance the resource for their research. And so I think one of the things we would like to come out of this meeting is what else should be done. These have been driven by the academic community. UK Biobank is there for the academic community, as well as being available to commercial researchers. And so we're keen that you say what should be done and what we can do to make it more valuable for you. Kathy Sudlow will talk about all the health linkage, so I won't go through this in detail, but the death and cancer, the hospitalization data are already in the database for you to use. The primary care data we hope to be adding during the next year. And then we're looking at the ways in which we can link to other kinds of health records and using web questionnaires, because we have 360,000 participants with email addresses, which make it easy to contact them, as well as using the mail for others, to get information about other kinds of health outcome, particularly those conditions that are not well diagnosed or underdiagnosed or not in health records. And Kathy Sudlow will also talk about the work that has been going on to turn record linkage data into well-phenotyped health outcomes that facilitates the research uses. So finally, the principles of access. And again, during the breaks, you can go up and meet with the team who administer that, and we hope can help you to work out how to access the resource. It's an open access resource. It's available to all bona fide researchers, academic or commercial, for all types of health-related research that's in the public interest. Very broad. There is no preferential or exclusive access. And that means that you don't collaborate with UK Biobank. It's your resource. You apply to use it. With respect to the use of data, the answer is almost certainly yes. With respect to the use of samples, we're having to look at developing ways in which to do that efficiently. You only pay for the cost of getting access to the data or getting access to the samples. The MRC and the Wellcome Trust have paid for the resource. They don't want their money back, or so far. Obviously, there's a limited amount of sample, and the Access Committee, the Biobank Board, and the funders are working with us to think about the best ways in which to make that available for research. And the simplest way is to do what they've done so far of turning the sample into data. So the genotyping of all 500,000 people, the biomarkers, 35 biomarkers on everybody. What are the biomarkers? And you'll hear about some suggestions for some infectious disease biomarkers later in the day. And all that's required is you publish. And then the data that you've used to produce your analyses go back into the resource. So if people say, I don't believe that, they can look at the data, they can analyze the data, they can check it. It's kind of perfect peer review, real peer review, where other people can check that things are being done properly. And this is the bit that we think is a little bit clunky. This is the application process. So this is my last slide. Here's a researcher. They register as a researcher, and I think about 1,000 have done so. They submit a preliminary application, which is very simple. And we're trying to then review those and agree them within 4 weeks, and doing pretty well on that. They then submit a more detailed application, a main application. These are then reviewed as well. At some point, the Ethics and Governance Council has an oversight role. The UK Biobank Board and its Access Subcommittee have to formally approve the use of the resource. Then a material transfer agreement is agreed, and then the sample is released. And that's what's been going on over the last 18 months or so. We're now reviewing that, and particularly looking at ways in which we can streamline it, ways in which we can have, if you like, class approval, so that it doesn't have to go through all of those stages. We're looking to combine this preliminary and main application. This was put in place to get things going. We recognize it's not ideal, and over the next 6 months or so, we're looking to really make it easier for researchers to get access. So, in conclusion, I think what makes Biobank special is, most importantly, the amount of work and thought that's gone into it from researchers all across the UK and beyond. The fact it is this very large prospective resource does allow people to determine the effects of risk factors on all sorts of diseases in a way that wouldn't be possible in kind of retrospective studies. It is extraordinarily detailed and becoming increasingly detailed as time goes by. And obviously, it's big. And it's that unique combination of scale, of breadth, of depth that I think makes it stand out. And it is your resource to do whatever kind of research you think sensible. In the review process, it's not reviewed as to whether or not it's scientifically sensible. It's for you to demonstrate that it is, and people can then either check and confirm that it is when you publish it, or not. So that's really to kind of kick off of what UK Biobank set out to do to get this to this point. And what I'm going to ask Naomi to do now, Naomi Allen, who's the senior epidemiologist on UK Biobank, is to give more detail on the baseline data and on access. Naomi. We will have time for questions to me and to Naomi after her talk and after all of the other talks as well.